Part 1. The Architectural Redesign of a Villain's Life. Julian Vance's previous life ended not with a bang, but with a spilled cup of cold brew and a sharp pain in his chest. He had spent his 28 years on Earth as a senior architect, meticulously designing sustainable eco-towers while surviving on 3 hours of sleep, sheer spite, and a diet of anxiety. When he finally collapsed over a drafting table at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, he fully expected the afterlife to be an endless void of peace and quiet. Instead, he woke up wrapped in a gaudy, gold-threaded silk duvet that probably cost more than his college tuition, with a splitting headache and a monotone, robotic voice echoing in his skull. Welcome, Host 884. You have successfully transmigrated into the hit ABO web novel, The Alpha's Empire. Julian blinked slowly at the heavily draped velvet canopy above him. I'm going to assume this is a stress-induced hallucination. Negative. You are now the villainous Omega, Julian Vance. You are currently in a high-profile contract marriage with the absent male lead, Duke Alexander Thorne. You are the step-parent to his 3 children, whom you violently despise. According to the plot, your role is to hoard his wealth, abuse his heirs, and ultimately die in exactly 5 years in a tragic speeder accident to pave the way for the true protagonist to heal the Duke's broken heart. Julian sat up, rubbing his temples. The memories of the original Julian flooded his mind. The original owner was a vain, screeching nightmare of an Omega who spent his days throwing wine glasses at servants, buying atrocious jewelry, and locking 3 traumatized children in the drafty west wing of the manor simply because they existed. Julian swung his legs out of bed, his bare feet sinking into a plush carpet. He walked over to a massive, gilded mirror. Staring back at him was a breathtakingly gorgeous man. He had sharp, aristocratic features, pale skin, silver blonde hair that cascaded over his shoulders, and the faint natural scent of rain and cedar. He was beautiful. He was also wearing a sheer, diamond-encrusted nightgown that offered absolutely zero thermal insulation. Let me get this straight, Julian said aloud, crossing his arms and shivering slightly. I am filthy rich. My impossibly wealthy alpha husband is currently fighting a war on the other side of the galaxy and hasn't been home in 2 years. I don't have to draft a single building schematic, and I have a guaranteed 5-year lifespan before I clock out for good? Affirmative. Your primary objective is to antagonize the children and the staff until your predetermined demise to generate plot momentum. Absolutely not. Consider this my early retirement, Julian declared, ruthlessly stripping off the ridiculous diamond nightgown and tossing it into a corner. He rummaged through the massive walk-in closet, bypassing rows of neon silks and leather harnesses, until he found a simple, oversized cashmere sweater and a pair of soft linen trousers. Host, you are deviating from the character setting. The original Julian would be demanding a diamond-infused milk bath right now. The original Julian had the fashion sense of a disco ball and the emotional intelligence of a wet brick. Julian replied smoothly, rolling up his sleeves. I'm going to take naps, eat carbs, and completely ignore your plot. His grand plans for a peaceful retirement, however, required dealing with the immediate environment. Julian stepped out of his opulent master suite and into the sprawling, coldly immaculate hallways of the Thorne estate. Within seconds, he encountered Elias, the estate's head butler. The older beta stiffened immediately, his eyes darting to the floor, bracing himself for the daily morning screaming match. Lord Julian, Elias said, his voice clipped and devoid of warmth. Your breakfast is prepared. Shall I have the chef bring the caviar and the imported sparkling wine to the solarium? And I will ensure the children are kept entirely out of your sight, as usual. Julian paused, taking in the butler's rigid posture and the genuine tension in the man's shoulders. The original owner really had terrorized this household. Elias, Julian sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose, cancel the caviar. It's 8 in the morning. I'm not a Bond villain. Just get me a black coffee, the strongest you have, and a plate of scrambled eggs, and unlock the doors to the west wing. The butler's head snapped up in shock. Sir? The west wing? But you explicitly ordered the children to be confined there until the Duke's quarterly stipend cleared. I changed my mind, Julian said, his tone leaving no room for argument, yet entirely devoid of malice. Unlock the doors. Let them roam the house. Oh, and Elias? Yes, my lord. If you ever serve me sparkling wine for breakfast again, I will personally rewrite the kitchen roster. Coffee, lots of it. I'll be in the dining room. As Julian walked away, leaving a deeply confused and slightly terrified butler in his wake, he mentally reviewed the blueprints of his new life. 3 traumatized, hyper-lethal children and 5 years to live. Well, Julian thought, breathing in the scent of his own calming cedar pheromones. I've renovated condemned buildings with worse foundations. How hard could 3 kids be? Part 2, Taming the Terrors. Unlocking the West Wing did not result in immediate familial bliss. It resulted in 3 highly suspicious, heavily armed children treating Julian like a ticking time bomb. The original owner had starved them of affection and resources, and the sudden shift in his behavior put them on high alert. Julian didn't try to be a savior, nor did he attempt to force emotional apologies for a past he didn't live. He simply treated the children the way he treated junior architects back on Earth, with dry sarcasm, absolute boundaries, and basic human decency. The Psychic Assassin, Silas 12. Silas bore the crushing weight of the family. As the eldest and an unpresented alpha, his telekinetic abilities had manifested early, sharpened by the need to protect his siblings from their cruel step-parent. The morning after the doors were unlocked, the 3 children crept into the grand dining room, expecting a trap. They looked like feral street cats ready to bolt. Julian was already at the head of the table, sipping his black coffee and reviewing a digital tablet on modern structural engineering. He didn't even look up, simply waving a hand toward the spread of food. Eat! You all look like you're one stiff breeze away from blowing over. Silas narrowed his eyes, convinced the food was poisoned. To test the waters, and Julian's new bizarrely calm demeanor, Silas tapped into his mental reserves. A heavy silver butter knife vibrated on the table before launching straight at Julian's head. Without breaking eye contact with his tablet, Julian's hand shot up. He caught the knife by the handle mere inches from his temple. The room froze. The maids gasped, backing against the walls. Julian smoothly lowered the knife and used it to generously butter his croissant. Your trajectory is flawless, Silas, but your weapon choice is embarrassing, Julian noted lazily, taking a bite. If you're going to threaten the life of your step-omega, use the steak knives. These are entirely too dull to be dramatic. Also, if you break my tablet, you're paying for it out of your allowance. Silas's jaw dropped. The boy who had spent his life having to be the ruthless, hyper-vigilant adult in the room suddenly realized he was completely outmatched by someone who wasn't even trying. The lack of fear, the lack of retaliation, it short-circuited Silas's defensive instincts. From that day on, Silas stopped plotting murders and started silently shadowing Julian, studying the Omega's unbothered confidence like a textbook. The genius of arson, Lyra 10. Lyra was a terrifying intellect trapped in a 10-year-old's body, coping with her severe abandonment issues by dismantling electronics and building highly dangerous, unlicensed weaponry. 3 days into Julian's new reign, he walked into his ensuite bathroom to find Lyra standing over a violently humming EMP device rigged to his vanity mirror. She froze, her shoulders hiking up to her ears. She braced herself, squeezing her eyes shut as she waited for the inevitable screaming, the stinging slap, or the threat of the seller. Instead, Julian casually reached over the glowing, sparking core, unplugged the device from the wall, and plugged in his espresso machine. The feedback loop on your plasma coil was misaligned, kiddo, Julian muttered, leaning against the cold marble counter as his coffee brewed. He tapped the side of her contraption. If it blew, it would have taken out the West Wing's electrical grid, including the library. But if you reverse the polarity on the copper wiring, you'd get a stabilizing core for a localized shield. Lyra opened her eyes, staring at him in utter shock. You aren't going to call me a monster or break it? Why would I break perfectly good hardware? Julian asked, pouring his espresso. You made a math error, not a moral failing. Though rigging it in my bathroom was a bold choice. Next time, use the reinforced basement. Now, do you want a waffle? Or are you going to keep staring at me like I grew a second head? Lyra's lip trembled. For the first time in her life, an adult had looked at her destructive tendencies and seen potential. They spent the entire breakfast sketching schematic corrections on napkins, Julian using his past life's engineering knowledge to bond with the tiny arsonist. The feral badger, Finn, 5. Finn was a superhuman ball of anxiety. Because his father was an elite alpha, Finn's physical strength was already monstrous, but his emotional regulation was that of an abandoned toddler. When overwhelmed, his survival instincts flared into violent, destructive tantrums. The breaking point happened 2 weeks later. A new maid accidentally threw away a ragged, torn blanket Finn had hoarded. Finn went ballistic. He tore through the grand hallway, shattering antique vases, ripping a heavy wooden door off its hinges and snarling like a cornered beast. The staff fled in terror, locking themselves in the kitchens. Julian, awoken from a rare afternoon nap, walked out in his socks and an oversized sweater. He stepped directly into the storm of flying debris, ignoring a splintering chair that crashed near his feet. He walked right up to the thrashing child, knelt and scooped him into his arms. Operating on pure feral panic, Finn bit down hard on Julian's shoulder, his sharp teeth piercing the sweater and drawing blood. Julian didn't flinch. He didn't scream. He didn't drop the boy. He simply wrapped his arms tighter around the trembling child and released a heavy, concentrated wave of his natural omega pheromones, the soothing, grounded scent of petrichor and ancient cedar woods. "Bite me all you want, gremlin," Julian said calmly, gently rubbing the back of the boy's head. "But if you ruin this sweater, I'm withholding the dinosaur chicken nuggets for a week." Shocked by the absolute lack of fear and utterly subdued by the enveloping, safe scent of rain, Finn slowly released his jaw. The boy's superhuman strength evaporated. He buried his face in Julian's neck and burst into ugly, exhausted tears. "There you go. Let it out," Julian murmured, standing up with the heavy child resting on his hip. "We can break the ugly statues in the courtyard later if you still feel mad. Let's get ice cream." Within 6 months, the dynamic of the Thorn Manor underwent a drastic evolution. The children were still ruthless, hyper-competitive, and possessed a terrifying streak for dominance. But they channeled it entirely into protecting their new, bizarrely wonderful step-parent. They became Julian's shadows. Silas managed the household finances under Julian's lazy supervision, ruthlessly firing any staff member who looked at the Omega sideways. Lyra installed top-tier security systems across the estate to ensure Julian's afternoon naps were never disturbed. Finn acted as his personal 5-year-old bodyguard, growling at any socialites who dared approach them during mandatory high society outings. If anyone at a gala dared to sneer at their step Omega, Silas would casually bankrupt their family's business by noon, Lyra would fry their estate's electrical grid, and Finn would promise to break their kneecaps. Julian had successfully renovated the Thorn family. He just didn't realize he had accidentally forged the most fiercely loyal, overprotective pack in the Empire, all completely devoted to him. Part 3. The Return of the Absent Alpha. For 3 years, Julian ruled the Thorn estate not with an iron fist, but with a raised eyebrow, an endless supply of black coffee, and a strict nap schedule. The manor had transformed from a cold, silent mausoleum into a chaotic, fiercely guarded sanctuary. Then, without warning, the master of the house came home. Duke Alexander Thorn was a terrifying figure. A decorated war hero and ruthless corporate conqueror, he stood at 6'4", radiating dominant, crushing alpha pheromones that smelled of sharp ozone and burnt gunpowder. He returned to his estate expecting the same miserable reality he had left behind. A screeching, vain Omega who squandered his wealth, and 3 alienated children locked in the West Wing. Instead, when Alexander pushed open the heavy oak doors of his manor, the air wasn't thick with tension. It smelled like baking chocolate and Julian's natural, soothing cedar. Following the scent, Alexander walked into the grand living room and froze. The 3 feral children he barely knew were piled in a chaotic heap on the plush rug. Silas was reading a book while using Julian's leg as a backrest. Lyra was dead asleep, drooling slightly on Julian's chest, and Finn was curled up at Julian's side, clutching a stuffed dinosaur. In the center of it all was Julian, wearing an oversized sweater, reading an architectural digest, and gently running a hand through Lyra's hair. Alexander's imposing alpha aura flared instinctively, a heavy wave of dominance meant to assert his arrival. Julian didn't cower. He didn't even flinch. He simply cracked one eye open, looking up at the towering, devastatingly handsome alpha standing in the doorway. "Oh, you're the husband," Julian whispered, completely unaffected by the oppressive aura that usually brought generals to their knees. "Keep your voice down. The gremlins just fell asleep, and if you wake Finn, I will make you sleep in the doghouse. And retract your pheromones, you're ruining the ambiance." Alexander was stunned into absolute silence. His aura fizzled out instantly. Before the Duke could speak, Silas snapped his book shut. The 12-year-old stood up, placing himself squarely between the imposing Alpha and Julian. Silas's eyes flashed with telekinetic energy. "Step back, father. You're disturbing him." Finn woke up at the shift in energy. Seeing the towering man, the 5-year-old didn't run to his father. Instead, Finn scrambled into Julian's lap, baring his tiny teeth and growling defensively at the Alpha to protect his Omega. Alexander realized with a sharp jolt of shock that he had been completely replaced. The children didn't fear Julian, they revered him. Unable to comprehend the shift, Alexander spent his first 3 days back running a covert audit on his own husband. He expected to find embezzled funds and secret lovers. Instead, Alexander's intelligence officer handed him a deeply confusing dossier. Julian's extravagant shopping habits had vanished 3 years ago. His recent purchases consisted entirely of advanced structural engineering textbooks, high-grade titanium for Lyra's projects, premium coffee beans, and an embarrassing amount of dinosaur-shaped chicken nuggets. Furthermore, the estate's finances were thriving, heavily micromanaged by a ruthless 12-year-old Silas under Julian's lazy supervision. The vain, cruel Omega Alexander had married was gone. In his place was a pragmatic, fiercely protective, and dangerously alluring man who seemed entirely unimpressed by Alexander's wealth or status. Julian, well aware of the Duke's confusion, had zero intention of treating the man like royalty. If Alexander was going to live in this house, he was going to pull his weight as a parent. "I don't care if you just conquered the Orion sector," Julian stated flatly on day 4, shoving a mop into the terrifying Alpha's hands after Alexander tracked mud into the foyer. "You make the mess, you clean it, and when you're done, your daughter has a science presentation she wants to show you." Alexander found himself utterly fascinated. He was a man who commanded armadas, yet he was completely outmaneuvered by an Omega who didn't demand money or try to seduce him, but simply bullied him into being a proper father. Under Julian's strict, snarky guidance, the bonding process began. Julian forced Alexander to sit on the floor for 2 hours while Lyra explained the complex mechanics of a newly built railgun. When Alexander instinctively tried to lecture her on weapon safety, Julian kicked him under the table. Alexander quickly learned to nod, ask appropriate technical questions, and praise her genius, causing the little girl to beam with pride. Julian organized mandatory weekly chess matches between the father and son in the solarium. At first, it was tense, but as Silas ruthlessly cornered Alexander's king on the board, the Alpha realized his son possessed a terrifying tactical brilliance. They bonded over complex war strategies, and Silas finally felt acknowledged by the only man whose intellect rivaled his own. Finn was terrified of his father's Alpha energy. Julian bridged the gap by casually tossing the 5-year-old at Alexander's chest one afternoon. "Catch. He wants a piggyback ride." Alexander learned to soften his grip and dial back his intensity, resulting in the universe's most feared warlord running around the gardens with a giggling, super-strong toddler on his shoulders. Inevitably, Alexander fell violently, irrevocably in love with his own husband. It wasn't just the way Julian had saved his children, it was Julian himself. Alexander found himself addicted to the Omega's dry wit, his quiet competence, and the rare, breathtaking smiles he reserved only for the family. The sweet moments began to accumulate, weaving a tight domestic web around them both. Alexander took to wrapping a heavy blanket over Julian's shoulders when the Omega fell asleep, drafting blueprints at his desk. He started waking up early just to brew Julian's ridiculously specific espresso order. Their pheromones began to naturally mingle in the hallways, the sharp, dominant scent of ozone and gunpowder perfectly tempered by the calming, earthy scent of rain and cedar. One evening after the kids were in bed, they sat by the fireplace. Julian, exhausted from a long day of breaking up Finn and Lyra's squabbles, accidentally let his guard down. He slumped sideways, his head coming to rest softly against Alexander's broad shoulder. Alexander froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. Very slowly, he wrapped an arm around Julian's waist, pulling the Omega flush against his side. Julian didn't pull away. Instead, he let out a soft sigh and leaned into the Alpha's warmth. I am a dead man walking, Julian thought, closing his eyes as a painful lump formed in his throat. The system's countdown clock ticked in his mind. He had less than 2 years left. He had sworn not to get attached. He was just an architect on a 5-year vacation. But as Alexander pressed a gentle, reverent kiss to the crown of Julian's head, the Omega realized the devastating truth. He loved this impossible, terrifying Alpha, and leaving them was going to break his heart just as surely as it would break theirs. Part 4. The 5-Year Ultimatum. As the 5-year mark loomed closer, the system's voice returned to Julian's mind, no longer monotone but frantic and glitching. Host, warning, narrative deviation at 89%. You are dangerously close to overriding the protagonist's entry. Plot correction protocols initiating. Your expiration date remains absolute. Julian's physical health didn't fail, but the world began to push back. The air around him sometimes felt heavy, and bizarre, near-fatal accidents began occurring with alarming frequency. A chandelier dropping mere inches from his shoulder, a speeder's brakes failing just as he crossed a street. Julian knew the narrative was violently trying to course-correct. He was out of time. He didn't tell Alexander. He didn't tell the children. Instead, Julian spent his final months quietly, meticulously preparing them for his absence. Julian treated his impending death like a building handover. He needed to ensure the foundation he had built for the Thorn family was entirely earthquake-proof. For Lyra, Julian spent late nights in her lab, casually leaving behind encrypted digital drives labeled, "For when you're stuck." Inside were not just advanced structural equations from his past life, but safety protocols, reminders to eat, and a single letter that read, "Your brain is a gift, kiddo. Don't use it to burn the world down. Use it to build a better one. And remember to reverse the polarity on your plasma coils." For Silas, the eldest boy, highly perceptive, sensed Julian's subtle withdrawal and became clingy, his psychic aura constantly hovering around Julian like a protective blanket. During one of their quiet afternoons, Julian gently forced Silas to look at him. "Silas, your mind is a weapon, but true power isn't about destroying your enemies," Julian told him softly. "It's knowing when to show mercy. Keep your siblings safe, but don't forget to let your father help." For Alexander, Julian cornered the imposing Alpha in his study. He made Alexander memorize Finn's exact trigger warnings. "If he cries, you don't logic with him, Alexander. You hold him until he stops shaking," Julian ordered, his voice uncharacteristically tight. When Alexander frowned, sensing the heavy finality in Julian's tone, he pulled the Omega into his lap, burying his face in Julian's cedar-scented neck. Julian closed his eyes, memorizing the warmth of the Alpha's arms, silently apologizing for what was about to happen. On the exact day of the deadline, Julian insisted on a mundane family outing. He took Lyra and Finn to the city's upper-level plaza for artisan ice cream, leaving Alexander and Silas at the estate to finish a chess match. It was supposed to be a perfect afternoon. Finn had chocolate all over his face, and Lyra was excitedly explaining the thermodynamics of the ice cream machine. Then the system intervened. Executing plot correction protocol, absolute. The sky above the plaza suddenly warped. A massive, localized gravitational collapse, an anomaly unseen in decades, ripped through the city center. The ground heaved violently, steel structures groaned, and the world began to cave in. Panic erupted. Debris the size of transport ships rained down. Julian's instincts, honed by years of analyzing structural integrity, kicked in instantly. He spotted a reinforced underground transit bunker 20 yards away. "Run!" Julian grabbed Finn and Lyra, hauling them through the collapsing plaza. Glass shattered around them in a deadly storm. They reached the bunker, and Julian shoved the terrified children inside. But the blast doors were damaged by the shifting concrete. They wouldn't close. "Julian, get in!" Lyra screamed, her small hands pulling frantically at his sweater as the plaza's massive glass dome began to collapse directly above them. "The locking mechanism is jammed. It has to be forced from the outside," Julian realized, his voice terrifyingly calm. He looked at Finn, who was reaching out, crying hysterically. Julian offered them one last bright smile. "I love you, gremlins. Be good for your dad." Julian stepped back, planted his boots against the groaning concrete, and threw his entire body weight against the heavy steel doors. With a sickening crunch, the blast doors slammed shut and locked, sealing the children safely in the dark, just as the world outside came crashing down. By the time Alexander's military speeder tore into the ruined plaza, followed closely by Silas, who was using his telekinesis to violently rip away 1,000-ton slabs of concrete, the dust was still settling. They dug like madmen. Alexander's hands were torn and bloody, his alpha roar echoing with primal, devastating terror. Silas's eyes bled from the strain of moving too much weight, but he refused to stop. They found the bunker. It was perfectly intact, but pinned beneath a massive, twisted steel support beam directly in front of the doors was Julian. "No, no, no!" Alexander choked out, dropping to his knees. He grabbed the steel beam, his muscles tearing as he tried to lift it, but it was structurally wedged. Julian coughed, a thin trail of blood escaping his lips. His breathing was shallow, his beautiful eyes clouded, but he smiled softly when he saw the Alpha. "Julian, stay with me. The medics are coming. Just hold on," Alexander begged, tears streaming down his face, his dominant aura entirely shattered into pure, desperate grief. "Don't be mad," Julian whispered, lifting a trembling, blood-stained hand to cup Alexander's cheek. He could hear Silas sobbing violently behind the Alpha. "Silas, tell the little ones I'm sorry. I told you, Alexander. I was only here for a vacation." "You can't leave us," Silas screamed, his psychic energy flaring wildly, cracking the remaining pavement. "You promised." "Take care of our gremlins," Julian breathed out, his thumb weakly brushing away a tear on Alexander's cheek. Julian's hand went limp, his eyes closed, and the soothing scent of rain and cedar that had held the Thorn family together simply faded away into the ash. Alexander pulled Julian's lifeless body into his arms, burying his face in the Omega's chest. The scream the Alpha let out wasn't just a sound of mourning, it was a promise of absolute cosmic violence. The system had forced the plot forward, completely unaware that it had just declared war on the most dangerous family in the universe. Part 5. Breaking the World. The system, an arrogant piece of cosmic architecture, assumed that with the villain out of the way, the original plot would simply snap back into place. The protagonist Omega was cued for their entrance, ready to heal the grieving Duke and step into the role of a loving parent. The system vastly underestimated the catastrophic damage Julian Vance had done to its narrative. The world had taken their heart, and the Thorn family collectively decided that a world without Julian was a world that no longer deserved to exist. 3 months after the funeral, the system attempted to initiate the main storyline. A sweet, jasmine-scented Omega, the intended protagonist, was orchestrated to arrive at the Thorn estate under the guise of a newly hired tutor. They were meant to bump into the brooding Duke in the Rose Garden, offering a soft smile and a comforting presence. It did not go as scripted. The moment the protagonist stepped onto the property, Alexander's lethal alpha pheromones hit them like a physical blow, dropping the poor Omega to their knees in sheer terror. "Who let you in?" Alexander snarled, his eyes burning with an unhinged, bloodshot intensity. The Duke hadn't slept in weeks. His once immaculate uniform was disheveled, and he emanated an aura of pure, suffocating malice. Before the trembling protagonist could speak, Silas, now a towering, terrifyingly calm 17-year-old, stepped out of the shadows. With a mere flick of his wrist, Silas used his telekinesis to lift the protagonist off the ground and casually toss them back through the wrought iron gates. "Change the estate's access codes," Silas ordered the terrified guards, his voice devoid of any emotion. "If anyone else smelling of cheap flowers comes within a mile of my father, I will crush their windpipe." The arsenal of grief. The Thorn Manor did not return to the silent, neglected state it was in before Julian. Instead, it became a manic, hyper-lethal war room. The grief of the Thorn family mutated into a violent, obsessive drive to find the entity responsible for the anomaly that took their omega. Silas's grief pushed his psychic abilities past the limits of human biology. Telekinesis was no longer enough. He refused to accept the physical laws of a universe that had crushed Julian. Silas began to manipulate quantum fields, bending light, gravity, and reality itself. He spent hours in the ruins of the plaza, mentally reassembling the shattered glass and concrete over and over, searching for a microscopic flaw in the fabric of space. Lyra abandoned her standard mechanical projects. She locked herself in her lab, fueled by espresso and a desperate manic brilliance. She took the final blueprints Julian had left her and inverted them. If Julian had taught her how to build stabilizing shields, Lyra was going to build a drill. She constructed colossal, unstable machines designed to pierce through the dimensions, theorizing that the anomaly wasn't natural, but a deliberate cosmic intervention. The 5-year-old boy who cried for chicken nuggets was gone. At 10, Finn was unnaturally large, a stoic and brutal enforcer with eyes as cold as a glacier. He stood outside Lyra's lab for days at a time, acting as an unbreakable shield against the military officials and politicians who desperately tried to shut down the Thorn's dangerous experiments. Finn trusted no one, spoke to almost no one, and aggressively guarded the one silk sweater Julian had bled on, treating it like a holy relic. Alexander weaponized his grief. He turned his massive military armada inward, declaring martial law across 3 star systems. He drained the Empire's resources, funneling trillions of credits into Lyra's dimensional research. When the ruling council attempted to sanction him for his tyrannical behavior, Alexander simply walked into the High Senate, slammed a fist onto the grand podium, fracturing the marble in 2, and dared them to stop him. "My husband is out there," Alexander growled to the terrified politicians, his dominant aura cracking the reinforced glass of the chamber. "Someone or something took him. I will tear the universe down to its atomic base if I have to. Anyone who stands in my way will be the first to burn." It took them 1 year. Deep in the subterranean levels of the Thorn estate, Lyra finally finished her masterpiece, the Chrono Displacement Core. It was a massive, violently spinning ring of plasma and titanium, powered by the entire planetary grid. "The coordinates are locked on the residual energy signature from the plaza," Lyra said, her hands flying across holographic keyboards. Her eyes were sunken, but burning with manic triumph. "I found a secondary frequency. It's an artificial code layer overlapping our reality." "Break it," Alexander commanded, standing at the center of the platform alongside Silas and Finn. Lyra slammed her palm onto the ignition sequence. The machine shrieked. The power grid of the entire hemisphere blacked out. Inside the lab, reality itself began to splinter. The air cracked like a shattered mirror, glowing with a blinding, terrifying white light. The system, realizing too late what was happening, flooded their minds with frantic, glitching warnings. "Warning! Unauthorized narrative breach! Characters cannot leave the construct! Abort! Abort!" "Shut up," Silas sneered, his eyes glowing pure white as he extended his hands. He grabbed the edges of the dimensional tear with his raw psychic power, and with a guttural roar, violently ripped the hole wider. Through sheer, overwhelming willpower, a warlord and his 3 terrifying children broke out of their written reality. They stepped into the void, following the faint, distant scent of rain and cedar. Part 6. The Dimensional Reunion. For the first time in his 2 lives, Julian Vance was entirely, utterly miserable. He had woken up in his own bed, in his own body, in his cramped, minimalist apartment on Earth. The system had seamlessly inserted him back into his old timeline the very second he died under the rubble. To his firm, his colleagues, and the rest of the world, Julian had just recovered from a severe cardiac event. It had been a week. He was supposed to be resting. Instead, Julian was sitting at his drafting table in the gray, dreary light of a rainy Tuesday, aggressively eating dry cereal out of the box. He looked down at his drafting paper. He was supposed to be designing a corporate high-rise. Instead, he had meticulously drawn the exact floor plan of the Thorne Estate's West Wing, complete with Lyra's blast-proof lab, Silas's extended library, and a designated indoor playground for Finn. Julian dropped his pencil and buried his face in his hands. He missed his snarky alpha. He missed the chaotic, terrifying children. He had survived death and rewritten a universe, only to end up right back where he started, alone, overworked, and exhausted. The breach of apartment 4B happened. Suddenly, the air in his living room dropped by 20 degrees. The hair on Julian's arm stood on end. His television flickered violently, emitting a high-pitched whine before the screen shattered outward. A robotic voice, one he hadn't heard in a week, shrieked in his head. Critical warning, host 884, anomaly detected, narrative entities are breaching the construct, structural integrity of dimension, X9 failing. The system's voice cut out with a pathetic, agonizing squeak of static. In the center of Julian's tiny living room, space itself began to peel back like wet paper. A blinding, terrifying white light spilled onto his cheap laminate flooring. A pair of heavy combat boots stepped through the rift. It was Silas. The 17-year-old was hovering 6 inches off the floor, his eyes glowing blinding white. He held his hands out, using sheer, catastrophic psychic force to hold the dimensional tear open against the crushing weight of reality. Behind him stepped Lyra, now 15, her face smudged with grease and soot. She was casually holding a smoking, terrifyingly complex plasma rifle. Then came Finn. The 10-year-old was already built like a tank, his eyes sweeping the small apartment with lethal, cold precision, ready to obliterate whatever threats this new world held. And finally, stepping through the blinding light, came the Warlord. Alexander looked awful. The impeccable Duke was haggard, his uniform torn, his face pale and sharp with exhaustion. But his eyes burned with a terrifying, obsessive red light. The sheer density of his alpha pheromones, ozone and gunpowder, instantly flooded the small apartment, rattling the window panes. Julian slowly lowered his box of cereal. He looked at the universe's most dangerous family, currently standing on his cheap IKEA rug. "You guys are entirely too dramatic," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. The sound of Julian's voice broke the spell. The lethal, untouchable aura of the Thorne family instantly disintegrated. "You left us," Finn wailed. The stoic, terrifying juggernaut instantly reverted to a clinging, desperate child. He threw himself forward, tackling Julian out of his drafting chair and onto the floor. Lyra dropped her world-ending plasma rifle onto the hardwood and dove in next, burying her face in Julian's sweater. "The math worked," she sobbed hysterically, her genius facade crumbling. "I told them the math worked, Julian. You promised you wouldn't go." Silas let the dimensional tear stabilize on its own, his glowing eyes fading back to their normal color. The hyper-lethal teen dropped to his knees beside them, his hands shaking as he grabbed handfuls of Julian's shirt, pressing his forehead against Julian's shoulder. Julian was completely pinned to the floor by the 3 weeping prodigies, his own tears finally spilling over as he wrapped his arms around them, breathing in the scent of plasma, ozone, and his children. Then a massive shadow fell over them. Alexander dropped to his knees. The Warlord's massive frame shook uncontrollably as he pulled the entire pile, Julian and the 3 kids, into a crushing, desperate embrace. He buried his face in Julian's neck, inhaling the deep, grounding scent of rain and cedar that he had torn the universe apart to find. "You are never, ever allowed to take a vacation without us again," Alexander choked out, his voice raw and broken. "I will burn down 1,000 universes. I will end reality itself before I let you go." "Host, you must return them!" The system panicked, rebooting in Julian's mind. "The structural integrity of this world is collapsing under their energy signatures. It will implode." Julian, still trapped under his crying family, narrowed his eyes. "I am not returning them," Julian commanded mentally, his tone as cold and sharp as forged steel. You are going to initiate a permanent return transfer for all of us back to the novel. Impossible. Your character is deceased. The protagonist is queued. I don't care about your protagonist, Julian fired back. Make me a permanent fixture of that world. Grant me admin privileges and absolute immunity from your plot correction protocols. That is a violation of core coding. Julian glanced at Lyra, who was wiping her tears and picking up her plasma rifle, looking highly offended by the glowing rift behind them. He looked at Silas, who was mentally flexing, causing the walls of the apartment to groan. He looked at Alexander, whose alpha aura was currently threatening to melt the building's steel girders. Violate the code, Julian warned the system, or I will tell my husband and my kids where your core server is located, and they will dismantle your existence piece by piece. The system calculated the threat level of the Thorn family. It took exactly 0.4 seconds to reach a conclusion. Transfer initiated, admin privileges granted, plot protocols overridden. Have a pleasant day, Host 884. The dimensional tear flared, enveloping the family and pulled them back into the ABO world. When Julian opened his eyes, he was back in the grand living room of the Thorn Manor. The dark, depressive energy that had choked the house for a year vanished the second his scent hit the air. Julian didn't have to explain much about his past life. Alexander didn't care if Julian was an architect from Earth, a transmigrated soul, or a literal god. All that mattered was that he was theirs. The aftermath of their reunion completely reshaped the empire. Silas officially took over the family's financial and political dealings. His ruthless efficiency, tempered only by Julian's occasional command to play nice and stop bankrupting people who annoy you. Lyra became the youngest lead engineer in the galaxy. She built revolutionary clean energy tech, all meticulously checked by Julian for structural integrity. Finn grew into his immense strength, officially taking the title of Commander of the Thorn Vanguard. However, despite being the most feared warrior in the sector, he still demanded Julian bake him dinosaur-shaped cookies on his birthdays. Alexander formally stepped down from frontline military conquests, preferring to manage his empire from the manor. He became notoriously obsessed with his Omega, entirely unwilling to let Julian out of his sight for